Dr. Amina Hussein and her colleagues at Jamiauniversityj for organizing this most impressive international conference on Islamic feminism and for inviting me to be a part of it. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. There, can everyone see that? Yes? Okay. So I want to begin this session with the mention of a woman's name, which, although not very well known, even to Muslims, is important to bring up in our discussion. And her name is Umara. Umara was the kind of woman who makes many men, and some women perhaps, feel uncomfortable. She asked frequent questions. She sometimes loudly protested the lack of fairness she saw around her, particularly in regard to women, and she was active in public life. The truth of the matter is that she was typical of the early Muslim women from the generation of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century and through most of the early medieval period. Umara is also particularly valorized in the early literature for her courage on the battlefield. According to the early Muslim biographer Ibn Sa'd, who died in 330 of the Hijri era or 845 of the Gregorian date, she fought fearlessly at a number of the early battles in Islamic history. During the Battle of Uhud, she defended the Prophet himself against a particularly ruthless enemy, and as a consequence was fulsomely praised by him for her matchless bravery. Another very important reason to remember her name is that she is cited as the reason for the revelation of a significant verse in the Quran. According to the occasion of revelation, the Asbab al-Nuzul, cited in connection with this verse, it was Umara who remarked to the Prophet regarding the Quranic revelations up to that point, saying, and I quote, "I see that everything pertains to men. I do not see the mention of women," she said. Subsequently, this particular verse was revealed. And now I quote, it's also in your the PowerPoint, "Those who have surrendered to God among males and females, those who believe among males and females, those who are devout and sincere among males and females, those who are truthful among males and females, those who are patient among males and females, those who fear God among males and females, those who give in charity among males and females, those who fast among males and females, those who remember God often among males and females, God has prepared for them forgiveness and a great reward." This is from Surah Al-Ahzab, chapter 33, verse 35. The Quran, as we see in this passage, specifically addresses women and uses language deliberately inclusive of them. This verse, above all, maintains the absolute religious and spiritual equality of women and men. No ifs, ands, or buts, no conditions attached. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that Muslim women who can read and understand the Quran for themselves draw their power and strength from the Quran. The Quran, after all, confers specific legal rights on women, some of which had not ever previously been granted to women and were quite revolutionary in their consequences. Thus, the Quran gives women a say in contracting their marriages, to hold property in their own names even after marriage, to seek divorce under specific conditions, although this is a practice not encouraged either for men or women, and to expect fair and equal treatment from their husbands in particular. And yet, despite these women-affirming verses, many, if not most, Muslim male exegetes, the commentators on the Quran, read the Quran through a masculinist lens and generated commentaries that promoted a patriarchal social order that created discriminatory treatment of women. Beginning in the 20th century, however, Muslim feminist scholars, mostly women, but also including a few men, started to go back to the Quranic text in order to challenge and circumvent the distinctively woman-unfriendly exegeses of specific verses generated by many influential male scholars. These feminist scholars hoped thereby to retrieve the original egalitarian ethos of the Quran itself. Through their egalitarian lens, these women exegetes offer critiques of traditional methodologies of engaging the Quran and offer alternative readings of verses that deal specifically with gendered relations. Their exegesis underscored the polyvalence of the Quranic text. That is to say, they emphasize the possibilities of extracting multiple meanings from scripture based on specific reading strategies that are fully aware of historical contexts and of the frequently broad semantic spectrum of key terms and concepts. Critical and occasionally revisionist exegesis of this kind, through a gendered egalitarian lens, is the foundation of what today we have come to term Islamic feminism, the topic of this whole conference. Thus, the well-known feminist exegete, Amina Wadud, author of the groundbreaking work Quran and Women, rereading the sacred text from a woman's perspective, suggests adopting what she calls a hermeneutics of Tawheed. Are we okay? So she calls this a hermeneutics of Tawheed, referring to a holistic method of reading the Quran that specifically challenged the line-by-line atomistic method of interpretation that was so popular among many medieval exegetes and remains so till today. If the Quranic claim of establishing a universal basis for moral guidance is to be taken seriously, comments Wadud, then Muslim exegetes must develop a hermeneutical framework that leads to, now I'm quoting from Wadud's work, that leads to a systematic rationale for making correlations among Quranic verses, and which sufficiently exemplifies the full impact of Quranic coherence. End of quote. Universals, am, and particulars, khas, must be distinguished from one another. Time and place-bound interpretations must be recognized as such, and their limited applicability recognized. Wadud's interpretive venture is then fundamentally concerned with retrieving an unending trajectory of social, political, and moral possibilities that remain consistent with the overall Quranic ethos of equity, justice, and human dignity in changing historical and socio-political circumstances. Another well-known prominent feminist scholar, Asma, similarly emphasizes the development of a new Quranic hermeneutics that would effectively challenge and undermine traditional understandings of key Quranic verses related to gender and women's roles in society. Barlach's remarks, and I'm quoting from her, she says, if we wish to ensure Muslim women their rights, we not only need to contest readings of the Quran that justify the abuse and degradation of women, we also need to establish the legitimacy of liberatory readings. End of quote. In order to retrieve such an egalitarian and liberatory perspective from within the Quranic text, Barlas and other contemporary feminist exegetes have typically resorted to a holistic reading of the text, so that single verses, especially those that appear to be promoting gender inequity, may be read in conjunction with other verses that are thematically and semantically related, allowing for the emergence of other interpretive possibilities. A common complaint on the part of Muslim feminist scholars is that despite a number of Quranic verses that clearly challenge patriarchy, scriptural exegesis undertaken almost exclusively by men in the pre-modern period has all but completely undermined the gender egalitarianism of the Quran and minimized the impact of its gender-inclusive language. This has led to the creation of a moral and religious paradigm which privileges the male over the female and accords to the former guardianship over the latter. As examples of such androcentric or male-centered exegesis, they point to commentaries generated by male exegetes on specific verses that refer to male-female relations and which have become influential and authoritative over the centuries. One such cluster of verses refers to the creation of Adam and his wife before their earthly existence. And there are a number of such verses in the Quran. For example, Quran 2:30, 39, chapter 15, 26 through 43, and others. It is noteworthy that Adam's wife, unnamed in the Quran, but named Hawa or Eve in the exegetical commentary literature, is not singled out for exclusive blame in these Quranic verses for having caused the so-called fall of humankind. Instead, the Quran blames Adam exclusively for the fall, or second, blames Adam and his wife equally for giving into the temptations of Satan. On the balance, Adam in the Quran is the one who is morally culpable for failing to heed God's injunctions and for giving in to wrongdoing. Adam and his wife are, however, forgiven by God, and they're given equal opportunity to redeem themselves by establishing a righteous and God-fearing community on earth. In its creation accounts, the Quran therefore does not assign any kind of ontological moral failing to the woman companion of Adam, and thus by extension to womankind in general. It is furthermore important to note that the Quran does not state that the woman was created from man. Instead, Quran 4:1 states, let me switch to the second slide now. Yes. Instead, the Quran in chapter 4, verse 1 states, O humankind, be careful of your duty to your Lord, who created you from a single soul, nafs wahida, and from it created its mate, and from them the two has spread abroad a multitude of men and women. Simultaneous creation from the nafs wahida, or a single soul, as described in this verse, negates the possibility of the male being granted an ontologically superior status by virtue of having been created first, from whose body is then derived the woman's. The Quran in chapter 3, verse 195 also states, I will not let the work of any of you, whether male or female, to be lost. Each of you is from the other. Both of these verses thus clearly undermine the notion of a hierarchical relationship between men and women and grants them instead ontological equality, that is to say, fundamental equality from birth. Retrieval of the meaning of these Quranic verses concerning Adam and his wife is highly important for these feminist exegetes, for it provides a corrective to a very different story that emerges from the prolific exegetical literature or tafsir concerning them. Commentaries from after the 9th century of the Common Era reveal that the Quranic assignment of blame primarily to Adam in the creation accounts proved unpalatable to a number of later Muslim male commentators, and they deliberately imported the biblical creation story into their interpretations to reassign the blame to his wife, whom they now call Hawa. Through the medium of hadith, the biblical story of Eve's creation from Adam's rib also took deep root in Muslim exegesis by at-Tabari's time, even though there is no mention of it in the Quran. Once again, such non-Quranic references allowed male exegetes to justify a secondary socio-legal status for women vis-a-vis men from the 9th century onwards. Culturally derived attitudes which progressively undermine women's equal status in society in the formative period of Islam stand therefore in tension with several passages in the Quran that affirm women's spiritual status and moral agency equal to that of men. One such verse is Quran 33:35 that specifically addresses women and uses language deliberately inclusive of them, as I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. This verse, above all, maintains the absolute religious and spiritual equality of women and men and declares all their meritorious actions to be worthy of equal reward in the afterlife. Another critical verse in the Quran, from chapter 9, verse 71, establishes equal and complementary moral agency for men and women. And this verse states, male believers al-mu'minun and female believers al-mu'minat are the partners, awliya, and allies of one another. They command the good and forbid wrong, and they perform prayer, give the obligatory alms, and obey God and His Messenger. They are those upon whom God has mercy. Indeed, God is almighty and wise. Feminist exegetes argue that the obvious intent of the verse is to establish parity between men and women as equal partners in the common venture to promote the good and righteous society on earth, and in the fulfillment of their individual and communal obligations towards God. However, male interpreters from the pre-modern and modern periods have understood this verse in ways that more often than not were consonant with their own particular views of proper male-female relations, and especially from the Abbasid period on, subversive of its egalitarian thrust. Typically, classical exegetes like At-Tabari and Al-Qurtubi restricted the wilaya of women on the basis of this verse to the religious sphere, and did not, and perhaps could not in their own time, derive a broader social and political empowerment of women on an equal footing with men. A number of Quranic concepts and terms which have been interpreted to convey gender inequality by classical male exegetes and jurists are similarly being revisited by feminist exegetes. Among these concepts is the term harth, which in its basic signification refers to a tilth or land suitable for cultivation. The relevant verse, Quran 2:23, chapter 2, verse 223, containing this term in relation to women states, your women are a tilth for you, so approach your tilth as you will, and send good deeds in advance for your souls, and fear God and know that you will meet Him. End of quote. Once again, we turn to At-Tabari's commentary as an example of classical exegesis of this verse. And he explains this verse as, your women are the tilling ground of your children, nisa'ukum muzdara'a awladikum. So approach your tilling ground however you wish and wherever you wish. End of quote. This notion of women as the tilling ground of men, generally understood to point to their biological and reproductive functions, is the pervasive one in At-Tabari's exegesis. He refers to several early authorities like Ibn Abbas and As-Suddi who corroborate this understanding. Furthermore, the sexual union between husband and wife, which is expected to lead to children, is to be considered among the good deeds carried out by humans. As the continuation of the same verse, send good deeds in advance for your souls, indicates. Thus, as At-Tabari documents, Ibn Abbas counseled people to utter the basmala, the Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, utter the basmala before commencing sexual relations as one would with any positive and licit moral act. On the whole, At-Tabari's exegesis of this verse conveys a positive valuation of the sexual and procreative functions of marriage, to be regarded as good deeds for which one will earn heavenly rewards in the hereafter. As Asma Barlas points out, this verse has, however, been typically construed by male jurists to imply that women are the sexual property of men, and that men have the right to sexual relations with their wives whenever and however they want. Read atomistically through a masculinist lens, the term harth, as it occurs in this verse, can then be understood to imply sexual possession of wives by husbands, highlighting as it does the sexual and reproductive roles of women. Barlas seeks to undermine this reading by going on to invoke another verse, Quran 42:20, which uses the term harth but not in relation to women. Let me switch slides again. Okay. Quran 42:22 states, to any that desires the harth of the hereafter, we give increase in his harth. And to any that desires the harth of this world, We grant somewhat thereof, but he has no share or lot in the hereafter. End of quote. In this verse, harth is clearly what humans reap, earn, according to their intention and deeds in this world. If humans perform good deeds with a view to pleasing God, then their harth, meaning recompense or harvest, is paradise. If one carries out certain deeds with the simple objective of profiting in this world, then the recompense will be in accordance with one's intentions. The larger point that Barlas makes in comparing these two verses is that the term harth does not ipso facto imply any kind of property that can be owned. Furthermore, a fuller sense of the equal complementary roles that men and women are expected to assume within an Islamic marriage emerges when other Quranic verses that are relevant to this discussion are brought in. Prominent among them is the verse in Quran 2:187, which reads, "Wives are your garments, and you husbands are their garments." Garments, libas, here are to be understood as a metaphor for mutual comfort and joy, and the equal rights shared by wives and husbands vis-a-vis one another in a marital relationship. Another equally relevant verse is Quran 30:21, chapter 30, verse 21, which states, "And among his signs is this, that he has created for you mates from among yourselves, that you may dwell in tranquility with them, and he has put love and mercy between you." Along with the previously mentioned Quran 9:71, in which believing men and women are described as the equal partners of allies of one another, they can be understood to be complementary in meaning. So when all these verses are read in conjunction with these verses, Quran 2:23, which refers to harth in relation to wives, is then more properly interpreted not as mandating an unequal relationship between husbands and wives, but pointing to two of the fundamental purposes of the marital union within Islam: the enjoyment of licit sexual pleasure and production of offspring. Here, women's distinctive biological functions are emphasized because only they are capable of conceiving and giving birth to children, just as men's distinctive biological functions are also highlighted in this verse because only they are capable of impregnating women. Both together participate in the process of procreation. There is nothing in the specific language of the verse to indicate prima facie that biological differences in themselves amount to an unequal relationship between the husband and wife. One would have to deliberately impose a gendered, hierarchical understanding on the verse, especially by subscribing to the view that the act of male impregnation is somehow morally and biologically superior to the female act of giving birth. The entire thrust of the Islamic tradition, which has glorified the status of the mother considerably over that of the father, would be against this particular interpretation. And one is reminded here of the famous hadith in which the Prophet remarks, "Paradise lies beneath the feet of your mother." And it's been recorded by Ahmad ibn Hanbal and Nasa'i and Ibn Majah in their hadith collections. Now let me go on to a discussion of the difference between the general and the particular, and how the failure to appreciate this difference leads to misreadings of the Quran. Gender scholars, feminist exegetes, typically insist that a fundamental flaw in traditional Quranic hermeneutics has been the inability of many exegetes to distinguish between the general or universal commandments of the Quran and the particular contextualized applications of them. In the discipline of tafsir, or Quran commentary, this division is well recognized in regard to the meaning of verses, am, general, versus khas, particular, but not necessarily applied in a consistent manner. This has led to what a number of scholars today consider to be misreadings of the Quran, especially when it concerns gender. This becomes strongly evident when we turn our attention to Quran 4:34, a verse which refers to the differentiated roles of men and women, specifically within the context of the family. The verse states, "Men are responsible for women, قوامون على النساء, because God has given some of them more than the other, and because they support them from their means. The overwhelming majority of post-classical male exegetes derived a theory of the general superior status of the male versus the female from this verse, and assumed that what may be understood as a functional description of the male's status, specifically within the family, as the economic provider, was instead a universal one, applicable to all time and place. Many gender scholars, including myself, disagree. They argue that this verse, when read together with other Quranic verses that deal with gender, conveys an inescapable fact that while fundamentally equal, humans have been created biologically different in order to perpetuate the species. In other words, only in particular contexts and circumstances will males and females assume different contingent roles and functions, the emphasis being on the contingent. Women alone can give birth and nurse, and thus in this particular circumstance, a husband is commanded by Quran 434 to provide material support to his wife. In their publications, feminist scholars have typically demonstrated that the Arabic word qawwamun used in the verse imparts the notion of providing for, and that the term is used prescriptively to indicate that men ought to provide for women in the context of childbearing and rearing. It also does not necessarily mean that women cannot provide for themselves in that circumstance. The term qawwamun is not an unconditional statement of male authority and superiority over all women for all time, as traditional male interpreters have claimed, but rather a functional and therefore contingent one. These women exegetes thus demonstrate how classical male interpretations have turned the specific and contingent into universals. Such a hermeneutic approach allows one to furthermore fruitfully explore the tension within the Quran between notions of functional superiority versus ontological equality, a key discussion that informs feminist and more broadly modernist engagements with the Quran. This tension had been insightfully underscored by the notable male scholar of Islam, Fazlur Rahman, in his well-known work, Major Themes of the Quran, and further elaborated upon by his student Amina Wadud in her book, Quran and Woman. Rahman had commented regarding Quran 434 that the status of men as custodians, qawwamun, of women that has typically been read into this verse is contingent upon the man's traditional function as the sole breadwinner in the family. In the modern world, large numbers of women work outside the home and contribute to the economic well-being of the family, or serve as a sole provider, which allows us to reassess the assumed absolutist implications of the term qawwamun in Quran 434. Furthermore, this verse discusses gender roles specifically in the context of the domestic sphere. When read cross-referentially with other verses, such as Quran 971, which I referenced earlier, that have to do with gender more broadly speaking, a more generalized understanding of a superior status for the male, qua male, for the male as male, becomes untenable and insupportable. In addition to qawwamun, the term daraja, as used in the Quran, has provoked quite a bit of feminist anxiety. The term occurs famously in Quran 2:28, the last part of which states, and I'm quoting now, "And the rights due to the women are similar to the rights against them, or the responsibilities they owe, with regard to the ma'ruf, and the men have a degree or daraja over them, and God is exalted in might and wise." End of quote. This is another verse popular with those who wish to retrieve a gendered hierarchy from within the Quran. Daraja occurring in this verse has been traditionally understood by pre-modern exegetes to refer to a man's degree above a woman, implying, according to them, a fundamental superiority of men over women. A cross-referential reading of relevant Quranic verses disabuses us of the notion that daraja is used in a gendered sense in the Quran. So let me explain that further, and I've actually written about this, so you would be able to access the fuller explanation of this. So there are 18 verses in the Quran that contain either the singular daraja or its plural darajat, including Quran 2 to 28, chapter 2, verse 228. The other 17 verses include the very important Quran 46:19, chapter 46, verse 19, which says everyone has a rank or degree, لِكُلٍّ daraja. Another verse, Quran 9:20, states, the ones who believed, emigrated, and strove in the cause of God with their wealth and their lives are greater in rank, Adam daraja, in the sight of God. And it is they who attain success. Let me just quickly check the PowerPoint, make sure I guess I need to go on to the next slide here. Oh, okay. No, we're still on the same slide. Okay. So the second verse that I just cited reads, the ones who believed, this is Quran 9:20, the ones who believed, emigrated, and strove in the cause of God with their wealth and their lives are greater in rank, Azam daraja, in the sight of God, and it is they who attain success. End of quote. A third verse, Quran 43:32 says, and again I quote again in translation, is it they who apportion the mercy of your Lord? It is we who have apportioned the livelihood among them in the life of this world, and have raised some above others in rank, darajat, so that some of them may harness others to their service. Your Lord's mercy is better than all the treasures that they hoard. So the first verse that I cited, Quran 46:19, refers to the simple fact that everyone, regardless of gender or any other feature of physical difference, has a rank or degree in respect to others on the basis of the characteristics they possess and the merit of their actions. The second verse that I cited, Quran 9:20, underscores the greater merit that accrued to those who embraced Islam in the early period and rendered great service to the Muslim community. These were the companions, male and female, who are the clear referent in this verse. The third verse, which I just cited, Quran 43:32, refers to those who have greater financial resources and can hire the services of others who are not similarly financially privileged. None of these verses explicitly link daraja to gender. This broader perspective is helpful for better appreciating the contextualized meaning of daraja in Quran 2 to 28. So the relevant part of this verse asserts that wives, since the context is clearly domestic, have rights and duties vis-a-vis their husbands that are the equal of the rights and duties of husbands toward their wives. Husbands, however, have an edge or advantage over their wives. Given my discussion of daraja as it occurs in several verses, I am interpreting this edge or advantage, daraja, as indicated in Quran 2:28, as a reference to men's greater ability to earn money and provide financial maintenance for their families. This edge is therefore purely functional and monetary or financial in nature, and gendered only to the extent that in the pre-modern world, men were the principal breadwinners. So you have a new slide here. A final verse I want to refer to that has been subjected to considerable misreadings, in my opinion, is Quran 2:282, which reads, set up 2 witnesses from your own men, and if they are not 2 men, then choose a man and 2 women as witnesses, so that if one makes a mistake, then the other can remind her. End of quote. Despite the fact that the context in which this verse is embedded is in reference to a very specific kind of financial enterprise, a loan transaction, dain, the verse has been invoked by some as a proof text to argue in general for a woman's legal testimony to be worth half that of a man. This is assumed to be because of her tendency to be forgetful and thus not as mentally competent as a man. This position is quite popular among conservative factions today, but as rigorous scholars have shown, this view cannot be attributed uniformly to the medieval fuqaha or jurists. Instead, we can establish that many medieval jurists had much more complex and sophisticated views on the validity of women's testimony. In fact, two of the most prominent pre-modern jurists, Ibn Taymiyyah, who died in 728 or 1328, and his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah, who died in 751 or 1350, both of whom, incidentally, are highly regarded in conservative circles today, came very close to articulating the equal valid testimony of women compared to men. These two jurists clearly understood that the general cannot be derived from the particular. Because of the restrictive context of Quran 2:282, a woman's lack of competency in financial transactions in the pre-modern world, when such competency would have been rare, has no bearing in other matters where she may have competency equal or superior to a man's, in hadith transmission and childbearing matters, for example. In fact, in the field of hadith transmission, with its rigorous standards of moral probity and accurate oral transmission, the individual testimony of women narrators about the reliability of hadiths related from the Prophet was freely accepted when they met this high bar. So feminist scholars bring in historical examples here to prove their point. They point to women companions who are hadith transmitters, of course Aisha, Salama, Darda, and many others who were recognized as authorities in their own right and whose reports were accepted based on their individual testimony. Both the Quranic context and historical practices, the living sunnah of the early community, therefore provide irrefutable proof that Quran 2:282 was not meant to constitute a generalizable rule about the value of a woman's legal and public testimony. Once again, when this verse is read alongside Quran 33:35 and Quran 9:71, which I referenced earlier, it is clear that the universal proclamation of women's ontological equality to men and affirmation of their independent moral agency in these two verses trumps the particularist understanding of feminine limitation as a result of historical contingency. So in conclusion then, we may assert that the more rigorous hermeneutics of the Quran adopted by feminists and other scholars today point to more interpretive possibilities than were imaginable in the past. In this exegetical process, they are resorting to compelling new readings of scripture that they take great pains to show do not violate the fundamental spirit and intent of the Quran, and which find expression in early Islamic history. Instead, they seek to demonstrate that such readings in fact represent a greater faithfulness to the Quran's core message of equality and justice that is not restricted by gender or any other worldly construction of privilege and difference. Let me now take you to my final slide. For more on a range of topics concerning Islam and women, I would like to draw your attention to my recently edited book, The Oxford Handbook of Islam and Women, which came out last year. And you will find references here to the latest scholarship on Islamic feminism and related topics. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments. So I can stop sharing the screen, I think. Okay.
That was amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.
In your edited volume, I mean, I'm very keen. I'll look at it. You have included Muslim societies from South Asia as well.
Yes, yeah. There's a whole chapter on South Asia. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Who has written that?
So I edited the book, the Oxford Handbook. That's my edition. Yeah. I contributed one chapter to it, and then the other chapters were contributed by different contributors from all over the world, mostly from the West, but we have some contributors also from the Muslim world.
Fantastic. I look forward to reading that.
Hopefully it's available in India. Probably through Amazon.com you'll be able to obtain copies. It's a big fat book.
Must be. It's a handbook, so it has to be a big fat book.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, Arushi, are you going?
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, there's a question in the chat box. Tara Rahman writes, personally, Amina Wadood writes, personally, I've come to places where how the text says what it says is just plain inadequate or unacceptable. However, much interpretation is enacted upon it. Amina Wadood is inside gender jihad. She says this particularly to reference Quran 434. She says we can promote the idea of saying no to the text, and they would love to hear your thoughts on the same.
Actually, I have a rejoinder to that position in my chapter in the Handbook of Islam and Women. So I think there's a gross misunderstanding, of course, of the verb daraba, which I didn't include in this presentation, which would have made it much longer. And Dr. Amina and I agreed that we would keep it to 45 minutes for my talk and take some questions at the end. So the misunderstanding emanates from the fact that daraba does not mean to hit or strike in every circumstance. Daraba can also mean to pat someone very gently, even lovingly. So we have usages of the verb daraba in Arabic texts, particularly from the classical period. There's a hadith in which the Prophet is described as sending Mu'adh ibn Jabal out to Yemen, right, to assume his position as governor. So he asks him, how will you govern? What are the sources that you will use as a governor when you're sent out to Yemen? And Mu'adh says, I will use the Quran and the Sunnah. And then the Prophet asks him, what if you can't find an answer from the Quran and the Sunnah? What will you do? He said, then I will resort to my rai, to my ijtihad, personal ijtihad. The Prophet was so pleased with his answer, the hadith in Arabic says, then he darabahu ala sadrihi, or something to that effect. Of course, he didn't strike him or beat him, right? Patted him lovingly and gently, tapped her. So I actually challenged the usual translation into English as beating or striking, which has caused so much harm, and we should challenge these harmful translations. The original Arabic has no such connotation of violence, but rather, simply, as I said, patting someone, even in a loving manner. So Professor Wadood, of course, did not take that meaning into consideration. Therefore, I challenge her understanding that we have to somehow reject this verse, to say no to him. I don't accept that understanding at all. And as I said in my own chapter in the Oxford Handbook, I actually provide this different reading and different understanding.
Thank you so much for that, ma'am. Nora has two questions. I think the first is, what advice do you have for those interested to contribute to Islamic feminist scholarship? And would you recommend any leads for them to pursue?
Well, get an excellent education, and I'm sure they're getting that. If they're from Jamiauniversityj, I'm sure they're getting excellent education. Learn Arabic really well. Arabic is a must. I'm always appalled by the fact that there's so many people, pretending to be scholars of Islam, and their understanding, especially of classical Arabic, is so weak, so deficient. How are they going to generate credible readings and authoritative readings if they can't understand the original text? There's a huge problem with English translations of the Quran. I've also written a lot on jihad in Islamic texts, and I looked at some translations of critical verses from the Quran, and those translations need to be challenged Because a lot of people who don't know Arabic and are reading the Quran in another language, especially English, will be misled by these translations, by these interpretations. So in order to become an authoritative scholar, and I hope you do, I hope you achieve your dream of becoming a scholar of Islamic feminism, get a wonderful education at the university level. If you have the time and the resources, the best thing, of course, would be to get an academic PhD, which exposes you to all the classical sources. You have to know the tafsir. You have to know all the hadith collections. You have to know the Quran really, really well, right? So intensive study of that sort, of course, would be foundational to your training as a scholar of Islamic feminism. I just saw something pop up in the chat box saying which university. Any good university which provides a degree, advanced degree in Islamic studies. And of course, we have an example of such a prominent university right here in the Jamia Milliya Islamia.
Yes. We have another question, but because it's related to what you just answered, for like graduate level people who are just getting into it, would you have recommendations of any translations that people could look up to? Of course, there will be problems in everyone, but one would you recommend the best?
So actually for the Quran, there's now a very good translation available, published by HarperCollins. It's a major publisher in the US, called The Study Quran. The Study Quran. And it's been it's been translated and edited by a very distinguished group of scholars, young and more junior as well as more senior scholars. And when it was published a few years ago in the United States, it immediately captured a lot of people's attention because of the quality of the work. They spent years debating the meanings of certain Arabic words. So it's not just a straightforward translation, they're also offering some exegesis, some tafsir, selective tafsir alongside the translation. So that makes it a very useful reference work for everyone who works on Quranic studies and who would like to have access to a translation. So it's, again, a kind of a big fat book, but reasonably priced. And it's the book I now recommend to my own students.
God. Nora has also asked, what can we do next in terms of affecting family law and jurisprudence in Muslim countries? How acceptable are these views, and when do you think these ideas or truths in quotation marks would make it to mainstream jurisprudence?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. I won't minimize the huge challenge that would face those reformers who would try to reinterpret traditional Islamic family law. Now, those attempts are being made. For example, in Malaysia and Indonesia, there are some women scholars that I'm aware of who are highly trained in fiqh, in jurisprudence, in tafsir, and who are able to challenge some of these traditional interpretations that do promote discriminatory treatment toward women, right? So I'm thinking of the group known as Musawa. Maybe you've heard of that group. Initially, they were called Sisters in Islam, and now they've developed into a more of a global platform. And so they include members from all over the world, especially the global south. And they call it Musawa, which is an Arabic word meaning equality. So it tells you right away what they are trying to achieve in their work. Their primary method of effecting change is education. I can't emphasize this point enough. Of course, many of us want change overnight, especially when you're young and you get tired of hearing the same things over and over again. But the best way to bring about long-term change is through education. Once these views become more common and are credibly explained by educated people, and students have access to these ideas in their universities, that's when I think these views will become mainstream, that they will move out into the general public sphere and there will be greater acceptance of these views. And we can already see that happening to some extent. I think most even jurists today in the modern period don't see anything wrong with women working outside the house, right? In the 18th and 19th century, there was, even early 20th century, there was a lot of opposition to the idea that women would go out of the house and work and even get higher education. Even though we know in classical Islam, women tended to be highly educated in certain social circles. And they were recognized scholars. They were particularly prominent in hadith transmission. So there's nothing within Islam that would prevent women from getting advanced education, becoming professors, becoming activists, becoming lawyers in their own right, and promoting these ideas on a large scale. So it will take time, but I think education remains the key to these transformative changes.
Thanks.
I think we have questions pouring in, Professor, but I think we'll have to pause. And I think those questions, Arushi, we can collect those questions and maybe Professor Afsaruddin can answer these questions later on. So we have more sessions planned ahead, so we have to stick to the time schedule. Thank you, Professor Afsaruddin. I have just few things to say. I mean, thank you so much for this very lucid and a very intellectually rigorous lecture. What we just heard was not just the rereading of the Quran, but really you recentered the ethical heart of it. You very carefully unpacked the verses 4:1, 3195 to 971 and 3335. It powerfully reminded us that Quran itself never really rendered women secondary or derivative, and it was deeply striking to learn how even in the creation story that you started with, blame is packed equally or even primarily on Adam, and how the concept of nafs al-wahida, the single soul, it very clearly affirms the ontological equality of women and men with which you started, and really spoke to the soul of this conference theme, and with great clarity. You also showed us, how the centuries of exegetical tradition written almost exclusively by men, have overwritten this equality and importing these extra Quranic notion from the biblical and cultural sources to justify somehow, women's subordination. So I think what resonated most today was the insistence that the feminist tafsir is not, it's not an external imposition. It's more of a retrieval. It's a recovery, something which is already there. So thank you so much, Professor, for restoring to us the Quran as a radical egalitarianism. And this is something we actually, in our inaugural ceremony, our Vice Chancellor also insisted and centered on the aspect of reading and the education that you also kind of advised to all these questions that have come up. So thank you so much. It's like coming to full circle as we come close to the end of this conference. So thank you so much for so persuasively, demonstrating and teaching us this project of, Islamic feminism, not as really an innovation, but a retrieval. So thank you so much for your time, Professor.
And I was also, Amina, going to say exactly the same thing.
It just came to my mind.
In the inaugural session, our Vice Chancellor insisted that people do not read Quran, they do not know Arabic, and they talk about Islam. They become scholars of Islamic this and that. And so I think you have reiterated the point with greater force and coming from your scholarship. This is so well taken. Thank you for pointing this out.
Thank you. Arushi, we can have a vote of thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to express my thanks also for this invitation. So I'm grateful for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Would just briefly like to thank everyone who was involved. First and foremost, of course, I would like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our Chief Patron, Professor Mazhar Asif, the one Honorable Vice Chancellor of Jamia Millia, and our patron, Professor Mehtab Alam Rizvi, the Registrar of Jamia Millia Islamia, for their constant support to all of our academic initiatives. Of course, our deepest gratitude to Professor Asma Afsaruddin for agreeing to today's lecture and giving us such an insightful session. It has given us a lot of information on the different verses that you have cited, a new dimension to look at works by Amina Asma, the later of whom we had the privilege to host at our center actually. And it has given us new tools to critically engage with the larger discourse of Islamic feminism. A special note of thanks to Professor Nishad Zaidi, our Honorable Director and the chairperson for this conference. Also, deeply thankful to Dr. Amina Hussain, the convener of our conference, and both of their initiatives again have led to this platform for all of us to be able to join and engage in such discussions. Lastly, of course, a deep thank you to everyone who attended and every volunteer, student volunteers, all of the participants who have been able to make this a grand success. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Recording stopped.
We have a technical session now that we are going to begin. I think Yusra is ready, and these again going to be parallel sessions. So we can go into a respective session, the participants, and then I think we should again meet at 6:30 for all of us for the valedictory, and that will be the close and the end of this.
Much awaited valedictory, of course. Excellent so far, Amina. Congratulations.
Ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Kindly create breakout room.